Afternoon. I'm Alan Solomon, the Dean of Tufts University's Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation with organizer, political strategist, and Tufts alumna, Wilnelia Rivera, the inaugural recipient of the Lyon Bendheim Citizenship Award. In a few moments, I'll introduce Tufts alumni and members of Tisch College's Board of Advisors, J.B. Lyon and Tom Bendheim, to talk about the award that carries their name and to introduce Wilnelia and our moderator, Kalima Knight. But first, let me acknowledge Tisch College's co-sponsors for this event, the Africana Center, the Fletcher School, Political Science Department, the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, Tufts Civic, and Tufts Action. Thank you all for your partnership and your support. I also want to thank our audience for joining us as we embark on a second semester of virtual conversations. These are still challenging times in our country and around the world, and I know that we all wish we could gather in person. But until we can, Tisch College remains committed to connecting the Tufts community through events like today's. In fact, Wilnelia is our lead-off guest in an extraordinary lineup of speakers this semester. I hope you'll join us in the coming weeks for conversations with, among others, Congresswoman Laura Underwood, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Michelle Flournoy, Fox News anchor Chris Wallace, Pod Save America's Dan Pfeiffer, former Republican National Committee Chair Michael Steele, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and Stacey Abrams. You can find more information and register for all of these events at our website, tischcollege.tufts.edu/events. We would not be able to host these extraordinary guests without the support of people like J.B. Lyon and Tom Bendheim, dedicated civic leaders in their own right who have been friends of Tisch College for more than a decade. J.B. and Tom are members of the Tufts class of 1985. They became close friends as undergraduates and remain so today. As students, they developed a lifelong commitment to civic engagement, and they both went on to enjoy considerable professional success. Tom is the founder and CEO of B7 Properties, a real estate development and investment company that specializes in residential properties. Previously, he held senior executive positions with PepsiCo, Dooney & Bourke, and CVS Caremark. Earlier in his career, he was a business consultant with Bain & Company and McKinsey. Today, Tom resides in Providence, Rhode Island, and serves on the board of the Institute for Nonprofit Practice, with which Tisch College serves as an academic partner. J.B. Lyon manages Mount Independence Investments, which invests early stage and growth capital in service companies and real estate. Before that, he spent 20 years as an entrepreneur, leading the launch of Staples.com and co-founding Uncle Dave's Kitchen, a nationally distributed brand of all-natural pasta sauce and condiments. J.B. is also the co-founder of the Rebuild Congress Initiative and a founding board member of Issue One, two organizations that seek to reform and strengthen our democracy. In 2006, J.B. and Tom together endowed the Lyon Bendheim Alumni Lecture, which brought successful Tufts graduates who were industry leaders back to campus for conversations about their success in professional and civic life. That lecture series hosted, among others, Warby Parker CEO Neil Blumenthal, former Time Inc. CEO Laura Lang, and Lowe's CEO John Tisch, the naming benefactor of Tisch College. J.B. and Tom are longtime members of the Tisch College Board of Advisors who have generously shared their time, resources, and expertise to support the college's work. I am personally grateful to J.B. and Tom for their ongoing commitment to Tisch College and to Tufts University, and it's a pleasure to have them join us today. And I turn it over now to J.B. and Tom.
Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm so honored and proud of all that's been accomplished by Tisch and what we're doing here today. I have to say, even though you said JB and I became friends, these were the days when we were at Tufts where they put you together as roommates. You didn't have a choice. So really, I had no choice but to be friends with JB, and still am today. Still feel like I don't have a choice. Listen, it's a privilege for us to partner with you and Tisch College. Our engagement with Tisch has been one of the most rewarding parts of our work as Tufts alumni. I know I also speak for JB when I say that we wish Tisch College had been around when we were undergraduates, and we're so proud of the work that it is doing with this new generation of jumbos. As Alan mentioned, we started the Lyon Bendheim lecture series because we wanted to bring to campus prominent Tufts alums to strengthen their connection with the university so they could serve as mentors, advisors, not just to students, but to the entire Tufts community. We initially focused on leaders, as you said, Alan, in the private sector, and we're really proud of all the business leaders that we brought to campus. But times change, and at a time now when our public life demands engagement from individuals and institutions in a wide range of fields, we wanted to broaden our focus and expand the opportunities for Tufts students to connect with leaders across the professional and civic spectrum who live up to Tufts' core values of civic engagement and social impact. So starting this year, we're excited to refocus and rechristen our initiative, the Lyon Bendheim Citizenship Award. This award now celebrates an individual, group, or institution that has shown a commitment to civic engagement through successful initiatives, creative solutions, or bold leadership. We're excited that award recipients will come to campus in normal times so that they can engage with Tufts students and faculty, and so they can serve as models of civic participation and impact for the entire Tufts community. Of course, unfortunately, we are virtual today, but we look forward to future years when we can all physically come together and enjoy a day's worth of programs that tap into our award recipients' experience and expertise for the benefit of the entire university community. I'm now going to pass it over to JB to announce and introduce the first recipient of the Lyon Bendheim Citizenship Award. JB?
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Alan. I want to echo your words of appreciation to everyone for joining us. And Alan, you've been an incredible leader for the Tisch College and just done amazing things, which I'm sure many people on this call know and recognize. And we couldn't think of a better partner than Tisch and you to help start off this initiative. And of course, we couldn't think of a more deserving inaugural recipient for this new award than Wilnelia Rivera, someone who exemplifies how to pursue political change and have a lasting systemic impact working across multiple segments. That is hard to do. Wilnelia is founder and president of Rivera Consulting, strategic consulting firm for movement building and policy-driven causes, candidates, and organizations. As a native of Puerto Rico who moved to Massachusetts when she was 8 years old, Wilnelia is a double jumbo who got a bachelor's degree from Tufts in 2004 and a master's in urban and environmental policy and planning in 2014. After graduating college, she worked as a community organizer in Chicago. Sounds familiar, like some president we knew. Later, she returned to Boston and worked with Neighbor to Neighbor, where she helped reform CORI, the Criminal Offender Record Information System, making it illegal for employers to ask about a person's criminal history on an initial job application in Massachusetts. Wilnelia also worked to push Lynn to invest in interpreters and translation services for non-English speaking parents in a more inclusive environment for LGBTQ students. Also, if that's not enough, involved in electoral politics, Wilnelia worked as a political strategist on Deval Patrick's successful campaign that made him the first Black governor in the history of Massachusetts. And more recently, she was chief strategist of Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley's groundbreaking victory against a 10-term Democratic incumbent, which made her the first Black woman from Massachusetts elected to federal office. Joining Wilnelia in conversation today is CoLab Knight, Tufts University Deputy Director of Media Relations. In that role, she has worked on proactive and responsive media relations for the university, with an emphasis on producing high visibility and high impact media placements about faculty scholarship, university programming, and student accomplishments. Before coming to Tufts, Kalima was the public relations manager of Simmons University, and before that, a reporter for the Boston Globe. She's got some incredible people on this call. We want to thank you for moderating today's conversation, and of course, to thank Wilnelia for joining us. We're incredibly proud of her work and proud to call her a fellow Jumbo, and we're honored to present you and Wilnelia, with the inaugural Lyon Bendheim Citizenship Award. Take it away.
Great. Well, thanks so much, JB, and thanks so much, Tom. Okay, so Wilnelia, welcome back to Tufts.
Yes.
And let me be among many people who are so happy to extend a huge congratulations to you for receiving the amazing Lyon Bendheim Citizenship Award. It's so well deserved, and I know I speak for the entire Tufts community when I say that we are thrilled to have you back, even if it's remotely. So you have accomplished so much since you were a student here, and I'm pretty excited to get into your experiences on campus. But I thought we could open up the conversation by talking a little bit about your upbringing. So you grew up in Lawrence, Massachusetts, having moved there from Puerto Rico at the age of 8. And this is after your mother had previously moved there from the Dominican Republic. But Lawrence is a really interesting city. For those of you who don't know, it's about 40 minutes of Boston, and it's a so-called majority-minority city. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in a city like Lawrence and how that shaped your perspective.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And first of all, also just want to thank Alan and Tom and JB and you as well, Kalima, for all the preparation behind this. And honestly, I still pinch myself when this kind of stuff happens. I like to tell my team and others all the time, I try to do this work in silence, but the veil of that is actually catching up to me at this point. But you know, two things about growing up in a place like in a community like Lawrence, where it's important to, you know, for folks to know that, you know, all if not most of my family still lives there, is it's a place where I both experience the realities of injustices every day, but I also experience persistent hope. And the combination of those two things is what allowed me to make the bridge from Tufts to, you know, from Lawrence to Tufts. The story that I will always share is Miss Gerber. Miss Gerber was my math teacher for 3 years in high school. And every year she would talk to me about Tufts and say, you know, I really think we should really apply. And I'm like, I don't know, Miss Gerber, this Tufts place that you keep on talking to me about, I'm not really that sure about. But ultimately, Miss Gerber, you know, created the relationship with me to make me believe that Tufts was a place that I could find a home, but not just where I could find a home, but that it could be a place that could support me, knowing that the bridge between Lawrence and Boston was only 35 or 40 minutes, but that the realities could have been hundreds of miles away. And I think that that's, you know, the importance of growing up in a place like Lawrence, right? That even, you know, 30 years later, you know, I'm proud to say that it's a community that it's better off today than it was yesterday. But obviously, you know, something like the pandemic has revealed the work that we all have to do. But a place like Lawrence is a place where everyday families are just really trying to make this thing work for their kids.
Yeah, that's great. So can you fast forward a little bit? You arrived on Tufts campus, and Tufts is a different environment than where you grew up. Can you talk a little bit about what that transition was like for you and what you did to successfully adjust?
Yeah, I mean, little did I know then that, you know, I learned something in that transition that I would carry with me for the rest of my life, which is, you know, you got to find your people wherever you are. Right. And environments are going to be different. But if you don't do the work to find your people, you're going to find yourself very isolated, you know, regardless of what the reality is. And sometimes those people will find you as well. Right. You know, I know that, you know, for my friends like Sherry and Doris that I met my freshman year became my lifelong friends. Right. Those are the people and my sisters that I still rely on. And when I think about the organizations that were on campus and off campus, those were also the mentors and the guides that truly, you know, gave me my first opportunity coming out of college, or taught me the ins and outs of what does it mean to have a degree, but like build a career, right? Because when you're 18 and 19 and 20, you're pretty naive about just going to get that good education, but don't really understand what the complexity of what it means. And more importantly, that, you know, the walks of life of everybody in school was very different. You know, I came in thinking that education was the equalizer, not realizing that the class was actually what got to distribute that, right? And understanding and learning that, and understanding how to navigate it gave me a life degree. You know, I may have had a bachelor's in international relations and women's studies, but the life degree that I got from Tufts was that, you know, you can't run away from, you know, how institutions are shaped, but that we have to learn the politics of difference to be able to coexist with one another.
Yeah. And so I thought it was interesting that you, by the time you graduated, you had a sense of exactly what you wanted to do right away, because you went right into your community organizing job. So what was it about your experience at Tufts that led you directly to make that decision so soon after graduation?
Yeah. You know, I think for me, it was actually what the perception of what my success was supposed to be after Tufts that led me to become an organizer, right? So I think as a international relations and women's studies major, and being a pretty good debater of ideas, one could say, you know, I think a lot of folks just assumed, including my mother, that I would go to law school. Right. It just only makes sense. Right. And when you're, you know, a kid like me that grew up from sort of lesser means, you're also being very practical of the prosperity that you want to build over the course of your life. Right. You can't be naive about that. But the truth is that I resisted the notion that my life was already set up for me, because I had these qualities that said that I would be this. And the reality is out of resistance, which you'll see it's a, you know, kind of a common theme in my life. I became an organizer. Right. And it was the resistance of not wanting to become what everybody else thought of me, but really wanting to experience what does it mean to, you know, what I would have said at 18 or at 22, what I would have said, what does it mean to give people the tools to be able to, for them to fight for themselves, right? You know, what I would say now is that what does it mean to create the conditions for people to have the agency for them to fight for themselves or live for themselves, right? And I think that transition is, you know, sort of a reflection of the experiences and the people that I've had the, you know, humility to be able to work with.
Yeah, that's great. So as you know, Tufts, specifically through the work of Tisch College, has a very long history of engaged citizenship. But can you tell us about your early experiences in community organizing and outreach, and maybe some of the more valuable lessons that you learned? And I say this particularly for the young activists and organizers who are with us today in the audience.
Yeah, no, definitely. I appreciate that in particular. And I think the one thing I would say is that the theory behind citizenship or engagement or organizing is important. You know, I think sometimes it actually gets kind of de-siloed from what's happening in the field. So I do want to say that as a, you know, activism isn't something that just happens, quote unquote, on the ground or within organizations or within communities, right? I am someone that it took me a long time to own this word or own this identity, but I'm a activist scholar, right, that does practical projects and practical work, right? So I share that because I do think that there's a long history of that, and sometimes it gets kind of like, you know, footnoted in the process. But I will say, in terms of the early lessons from my community organizing and outreach work that I think is valuable for all activists or change agents, however you sort of see yourself, is that people matter. And I think we all inherently understand that as an aspirational sort of value, right? Especially if you care about engagement and public service, right? But that's not enough, right? And what I learned about those early years is that power matters, money matters, and systems matter. And how they interact with one another ultimately dictates the conditions for what's possible or not, whether that's in politics or whether that's in what next zoning law gets changed in your neighborhood, right? So these systems are constantly interacting with each other. And you can say that your specialty is, you know, policy, but if you want to ignore all the other things, that's fine. But chances are you're going to continue to try to get the same thing and not get it. Right? So what does it mean to actually dissect that as a part of engaging and organizing and outreach, so that you can actually move the work forward, as opposed to just doing the same thing over and over again. And I think the last thing I'll say is that the reason why that's so important is that when we're, at least for me in my own experience, I'm usually inviting people who are not a part of this work in whatever capacity to give up a part of their everyday life to something that's bigger than them. And I feel it's a responsibility on my end to be knowledgeable on power, money, and systems so that I can create a baseline of understanding for why it's going to be tough, for why it's going to take a long time, and for why something is possible today versus tomorrow. Right? Because it gives people the agency again to think through, do I want to be a part of this? Or do maybe I want to be a part of something else, right? And I think that responsibility, you know, again, whether you call yourself an activist or an organizer, is a moral compass and an integrity that really frames and drives everything that I do.
Mm. Wow. So where would you say you learned that philosophy? Was it while in sort of the trenches with the organizing?
I would say it's in both places. And practically speaking, you know, I got the opportunity to come back to Tufts, right? You know, obviously I was there as an undergrad, and it's funny because whenever I hear Tisch, I think of like the quiet study room and all the hours I spent there to make it through midterms and finals. But when I came back for graduate school, I get to study it. That's actually what I did for urban planning. I was able to learn the research techniques and the planning tools that could allow me to look back at the work that I was a part of in community and organization, but also at a larger ecosystem, to really understand the shifts of like how this work has happened, right? And I think having that lab space, as I like to call it, in creative space really allowed me, honestly, to understand the math behind what fuels then, you know, this is about 10 years ago, what could potentially fuel statewide political shifts. And it's actually the basis of the math that informed the strategy that I used in Ayanna's campaign. It was just kind of sitting in a nice little thing, kind of, you know, picking up, you know, dust for a few years. And when I decided to come back into politics, I was like, wait a second, I have the math for this. So that's how it all comes together.
That's great. That's a great segue.
Yeah.
Let's move on to politics.
Mm.
You served as the chief strategist and advisor to then Boston City Councilor Ayanna Pressley's groundbreaking congressional campaign in 2018 against 10-term incumbent Michael Capuano, as was already said. Congresswoman Pressley won with 59% of the vote, becoming the first Black woman elected to Congress from Massachusetts. You also helped to elect former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick, who was the first Black governor of Massachusetts. What did you learn about the campaign or helping running the campaign of a Black candidate in a city and a state where there is a history of a lack of representation that really ultimately made both of them historic first? And do you have any lessons to share with other candidates who are themselves seeking to break political molds in places where they are seeking office?
Yeah, well, these are great questions. You know, I'm going to expand the audience to think about candidates and activists on this one. And the reason for that is that, you know, most of the work I did before Ayanna's campaign and the work I did as part of, you know, helping elect, you know, Governor Patrick was all work that was rooted in the grassroots and the parochial politics of Massachusetts. So what does that mean practically? It means running state rep races and state senate races and school committee races in places like Springfield, Holyoke, Worcester, you know, Boston. And I share all of that because one thing about Massachusetts, whether it's Massachusetts or anything else, you got to learn the context of how things happen, right? Both, you know, in the context of, you know, Ayanna and Deval, they are both students of history and students of politics, right? They may have been first-time candidates in some degree. You know, there's similarities, there's differences amongst them that are different, right? But they're both non-traditional in that they didn't just wait until the time was right, right? Or they kissed all the right thing, or, you know, talk to all the right people. They did their homework, built their plan, and executed it. And when the time was right for them and their family, they took that chance, right? And not just that, they also understood that it was going to require a movement of both those that have been involved in politics and those that have not been involved in politics, right? And I think that that's a key recipe of what I learned, you know, when I was at Neighbor to Neighbor, when I was with Deval, when I was in part of the campaign and the administration, and what I brought into Ayanna's campaign, right? And I think the last thing that I would also say is that these campaigns also need to be opportunities where you're developing the next generation of leaders as well. And I think that that's the synergy amongst all of them, right? That, you know, those are the lessons that people that are either thinking about running or wanting to run first, there's no criteria. There really isn't. I think back at, there used to be a mold of like having to be a lawyer or a business person or these sort of very, discrete sort of careers. It doesn't mean that there aren't challenges that are going to be unique to sort of what your starting point is, right? But our democracy needs more people that didn't think their whole lives of being a politician to run for office. Our democracy needs that, right? So I share that because I do think that that's part of the importance. And then lastly, the other thing that I would also share that sometimes my background doesn't really reveal is that, when I talk about understanding power and understanding money, it's not just the theoretical side or doing the research to understand like where the money goes or where it flows. It's doing the donor organizing work and donor cultivation work. At the end of the day, it takes money to run campaigns and you can't be naive about it. And what does it take to also do that part? And there's a lot of beautiful platitudes that we can share about how you can fund that through the grassroots and you can fund that through, more politically independent means, but you still need a diversified portfolio of funding to run a campaign, right? So I do also just want to share that too, because I do think that actually is the number one, one of the biggest challenges in running for office is can you do that part of the work, because it's also required, right? So again, and don't think of these smaller campaigns as opportunities for you to learn as well on how campaigns happen, right? Because it's not like how it happens on TV at all. And I think that there's a lot that people can learn from just learning how campaigns happen if you actually want to run in the future at some point. So it's a few pieces to share there.
Yeah, that's very insightful. So you've worked on the electoral politics side and you've worked in the movement politics side as an organizer. What do you tell activists who may be frustrated by what they see as too little or too slow change in government? And on the other side, what do you tell folks in the electoral politics who themselves may be frustrated by what they might describe as sort of this uncompromising energy of activists? Mm-hmm. How do the two sides work together productively with all that tension?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the good thing is that a question like this a few years ago could have felt like I was having these conversations more in the same sample universe of people, but in the last 2 years, this question is become more and more popular, and I think that's an important indication of just sort of the recognition that electoral politics and movement, organizing and politics actually do exist in the same democracy. Mm-hmm. Often at Rivera Consulting, we like to talk about it as deep democracy. It's sort of like, instead of thinking about it as democracy as we know today, or, unfortunately, as we see today, we need to look at it a little bit deeper than that, right? And how is it that both electoral politics and movement actors are coming together within a particular geography or a particular state? And I think the other thing I would say is that we got to reframe this tension. It's a discomfort. We live in a multiracial society that has real identities that people have, right? Some of these identities are multiple within one person. Some of them are just one for one person, but there's never one. And I think we have to learn what's the politics of difference and what's the practice that we have to learn as citizens, right? As residents, to be able to address this tension, right? So, and the framework that I would offer for all of you as you're thinking about this, more practically, is ask yourself a few questions when that discomfort comes up. Why? Why are you uncomfortable? Why am I uncomfortable? What do I have to learn from this, right? And in that self-reflection, what kind of new conversation can you have with the same people, right? Even though at the end of that conversation, you're still going to have the same differences probably, but you're able to listen. Right. And I think that's actually the core element of what's missing in our democracy and in our society. We don't know how to listen to one another. Right. We can do campaigns, we can write great PR releases, we can do all the different tactical things. But the art of the conversation with each other ends up falling down the wayside. And we see that in our democracy. And I think more specifically in terms of the electoral politics and the energy of activists, I would say it's more than energy. What organizers and activists do is that they hold the moral arc of what's possible. No matter what the congressional cycle says, no matter what the election cycle says, no matter what the weather says, they're going to hold on to that. And we need that. We need people in society. They're going to hold on to the most important values of justice, of who we should be as a country. And it's and what I've learned from being in both spaces is that politics is only movable when movement comes in, Because if not, politics, because what I've learned in politics, and the best advice I ever got really early on in Beacon Hill was, politics is what's possible. So when we're in the building, whatever the building is, our job is to make it possible. And I would go back and be like, well, true, okay, I can do that. But what if we have a movement that changes what's possible? And how do these two things speak to one another so that it's actually more coordinated and we're not just screaming and having a fight about all of our differences, but yet not really making progress where it matters the most in the buildings where laws and rules and the rules of engagement are made every day. And I think, for instance, the defund the police is a great example of this, right? Where folks are, it's a live example, right? The Biden administration is making very clear that is not the approach, right? But defund the police was an opportunity for Black Lives Matter to get the rest of the country to pay attention to something that for hundreds of years we've been trying to get more attention on, right? And that's the opportunity. It creates now the opportunity for politics to be possible. So whether people are engaging on that at a local level or they're engaging at that at a federal level, what does it mean to have a democracy where we allow for a common ground around urgency? Because we spend too much time saying my thing is more urgent than mine, but how much time do we spend on building the common ground to understand what's urgent for each other at this moment, right? So I'll stop there because I know I can probably go on forever on this, but I do think from a place of equity, I think part of the learning that we're going through as a country right now is that the common ground is reflected in Black lives. And there's a deeper discomfort that we all have to wrestle with, whether it's within your identity or identities, about why that makes you uncomfortable, right? Why we need to listen around that, and what does it mean to solve from a different perspective, right? From a common ground that recognizes that Black communities in our country have been the target of structural inequity, right? But I'll stop there.
No, that was great, and I just have a quick follow up to that, particularly again for the students who are in the audience. But how do we get to a place where people are listening to each other in a more effective way? Because it seems like everybody has an opinion, and like you said, we have to learn how to be uncomfortable and how to listen. But how can we learn how to listen to one another more effectively?
I think one thing I'll say is that there's not a one size all fits solution. And what I've learned in practice is that the number one way to practice this is relational. We try to dissect it, we try to research it, and all those things are important because they allow us to understand what progress we've made or what thorns are still in the way, right? But what we don't do is stick to the practice. I took a trip a few years ago with a group of change makers in Israel, and a value that was shared from an organization there was, we just all accept that we're not leaving the room or the country. And these are folks that have inherent differences. Actually, they're never going to change, but a recognition that they're never leaving and that they're here and that they're these values means that there's a commitment to the practice. And I think that that's the thing around listening that we have to understand as a country. We're not going to find a capitalist solution to listening to each other. We already have social media and so many other ways for doing that. But we don't want to go back to the core, which is a practice of talking to each other and ourselves, right? And I want to bring the self into that because I think that scale is important, right? I cannot, as a facilitator, walk into a room and ask people to grow in a way that I have not grown myself or that I'm not going through. And that's why often we don't ask people to grow in that way, because why would I if I'm not doing it myself, right? But again, it's relational. And it's the commitment that we're in this room together, right? And that for some of us, like myself, I see myself as a person that is responsible for creating the conditions that allow for people to come into a room and have that. And that for some people, their sense of safety is not going to be there for them to walk into that room. And that's okay, right? Because we have to also have patience, right? To be able to generate that trust, right? But what are we actually doing every day to practice that why?
Thank you for that. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit to the topic of identity, which you shared a little bit during some of your responses, but I'll say this, you describe yourself as a Black Latina, and in that context, you said this: In non-Latino and Latino spaces, I amplify my identity by modeling the complexity of who we are through my leadership style and areas of focus. I am a change agent, not a preacher. A change agent refuses to become sheep and always looks for executable strategies that allows for a new path, a solution, or idea to emerge. America has been eroticizing us since the days of Carmen Miranda in Hollywood movies. I refuse to allow Latinos to be simplified into data metrics or preconceived notions of who we are or where we come from. We must all resist. Too often, I see us resist this in the spirit of getting along, or worse, because we think this is building power. But in the pursuit of our success, we have adopted a broad, heteronormative, and non-inclusive brush of who we are as a community. This leaves too many of us behind. If we don't promote our authenticity, who will? I feel like I could get a t-shirt with that last phrase. Can you just share a little bit more of the point that you were making with that comment, and then just talk a little bit about identity and how it can be used to break through?
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you this: you're really good at digging this stuff up. I mean, when I saw this reflection, I was like, man, I remember writing this and seeing this again in the midst of the pandemic. It makes me realize. This is a question that I think pre-pandemic, I would have given you a very sanitized response to. And I just wanted to say that, to be very, very, to be radically honest with folks. And the reason for that is this question that I have in that statement. If we don't promote our own authenticity, who will? We ask parties, we ask systems, we ask our partners, we ask our loved ones, our siblings, to promote us, to love us. But what am I doing to level the identities of me? What identities am I prioritizing? Because I know that they open up room that allows me to be successful. But is it really? But it's taking away light that allows for others to engage in that with me, right? So I say that because what I've learned is that the multiple identities that I have coexist. And unless I can walk into that authenticity whenever I walk into a room, whatever it may be, then the work I'm doing also is not going to reflect that. And my identity at the end of the day, or the multiplicity of them, I see them as like a, for anyone that likes, exponents, I see it as like a breakthrough exponent. It's something that continues to build on itself over time, right? And the scale matters because even though my identity is personal and it's connected to my family, my ability to step into my authenticity allows me to take that into my work, whether that's working with organizations or with candidates, in a way that's very different, right? I'm able to speak truth in a way that allows me to both move the work, but doesn't stop me from speaking my own truth, right? And I understand that for some people, they may say, well, it's easy to say that now at almost 39 and versus being 18 or being 25. But, I think one thing I've learned from being on intergenerational teams is that, younger folks live in this authenticity in a way that is very different than I think, my generation or those that are older than me. I think that for someone like me, I think most of my life I've been trying to strive towards this authenticity, and I've found strength and courage from this pandemic and from younger people that I do this work with. And it's my return to movement politics that has allowed me to bridge this authenticity, right? And moving away from traditional politics, right? Because I think sometimes what I've also learned in all this is that not all spaces will allow my full authenticity to be real or recognized. What they're gonna ask me is, Wilnelia, we really love this part, but can you keep the gay part out? Cool, right? That's cool. Okay, cool. And old me would have been, that's fine. I don't want to make people uncomfortable. Cool. Let's move on anyways, right? Like, I don't break bread with you anyways. Like, but that's me telling myself a narrative that I'm okay with the harm that people are going to create, right? And that's not real, right? Because then I'm not coming into the work genuinely. So again, what I've learned is that even though my identities are personal, the scale in which I bring them to does matter because it impacts how I do the work, right? So now that I'm training my research team on liberation data collection methods, right, for research, That's what it means, right? And that can coexist with traditional ways of research as well, because we actually need the convergence of all of our knowledge, right? We live in a world where we say only some knowledge matters and the rest, we'll pretend it's not there, but we'll still use it though. Right. So I do think that that's fundamentally sort of where I'm coming from when I talk about sort of this approach of thinking through the self ecology work that needs to happen in order for us to move through systems and society in a way that's actually more authentic.
It was great. So on the flip side, can you talk a little bit about just how you personally manage, what I would describe as sort of this deluge of, understanding of the pervasiveness of all of the structural barriers, this deluge and fire hose of just challenging news and just, we're in challenging times. How do you manage that, and how do you refresh yourself to keep on keeping on?
Yeah, I mean, some personal practices, and I think they're different for folks, for everybody. But honestly, I don't listen to as much social media. I haven't had a TV in my house in like over 4 years, and I haven't had cable in over 15. And they're funny, but I say that because I do think that the accessibility of the world at your fingertip makes our interpersonal relationships inaccessible. And what I've learned is that the way to deal with it is forcing myself to be relational, even when I don't want to be, right? Right. When it's like, you know what, I'm gonna jump on that call at 6:30 and like talk to the homies for a little bit, right? Because even though I'm exhausted from another day in the pandemic, or even from a regular day before life, this is a priority to me because it's gonna open up a different space, right? Because even if we talk about this bad news, if it comes up, it's gonna be from the place of humor, or like, venting, right? So it's a different place. And I do think that that's an important part, right? Where is the joy, in life? And then I know that it's something that doesn't feel accessible for everyone, right? Sometimes, but we all have ways of doing that, right? And what does that mean as an antidote, honestly, to the constant pervasiveness, right? Because it's not just bad news; it's both the internalized supremacy that's within us and that's external to us, right? Often I try to correct people when we just talk about white supremacy. I'm like, look, we're fighting supremacy culture. Because we got gender supremacy, we got class supremacy, we got a lot of things going on here. But ultimately, we got supremacy that we're dealing with, right? And we actually can't think that we can live in a world that ignores it, because it is constantly around us and it does make us sick, some of us more sick than others, right? So what are the practices that we need with each other that are outside of that, right? And practicing those things over and over again, because even though they might feel tedious, it's actually what you need the most.
Yeah, that's great. So we're going to wrap up the moderated portion of our interview, and we're going to jump into some questions, and let's see how we'll do this. So Dave, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, Wilnelia. My name is Dave Nusher, work in communications and marketing with this terrific person on your screen here. Congratulations on your recognition for the Lyon Bendheim Award. My question for you is, we're 2 weeks away from Women's History Month, and I'm wondering, as you think about women, either colleagues, mentors, and/or women from history, who are the women that have inspired you during your career?
Because there's so many that I can list, I'm gonna share, I think, the one leader that I've been finding a lot of like situational inspiration from throughout this pandemic, right? Because I think sometimes that's kind of where we are. But that's Fannie Lou Hamer. She's a civil rights leader, democracy leader, reproductive justice leader, who if you ask me, she's an important reason why she's one of the important reasons why democracy even exists, and why the Democratic Party even shifted from a white supremacy party to a party that then allowed seats for Black people to be a part of, and that's an invisibilized history, and that we only talk about her every so often, when in fact there's so many Black women like her that we're both business leaders, spiritual leaders and movement leaders, but their contributions to building our party and building, our democracy across the South, in particular, is invisibilized. So that's a particular leader that I'm just continuing to, even though I've always known about her, it's like I'm relearning her stories as a way of getting courage as we go through this journey.
That's great. Let's see who else is on our. Hillary, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, my name's Hillary Cooper. I'm a graduate of Tufts, but I won't tell you what year.
It's all good, no worries.
I'm just kidding. So I was wondering, in organizations, I'm talking specifically about schools and education, but how can we enlist or bring in the voices of people who identify with the majority, so that we understand the resistance and kind of what we're up against for those of us who are, want to make changes.
So you said for those of us that want to make changes in the majority, can you just share a little bit on that? I don't want to make an assumption there.
No, I mean, in organizations that are, I'm specifically talking about a school, private school.
Okay, yeah.
Any organization. And a lot has come out about racism, internalized racism in the community. And there's a lot of talk. We're trying to galvanize and get together to try to make changes. But there's a lot of resistance and also a lot of misunderstanding about the white majority voices in our community. And I feel like if we ignore those, we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah. No, okay. No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think what I would advise in this particular situation is that find the coalition of the willing. Your instinct is already there in that by excluding the dominant voice, sometimes not even the majority, sometimes it could just be the dominant voice or dominant thinking, right? If you exclude it, it's not authentic. And you're going to end up in the same situation. And you may have a good progress process for some of the people involved. But what I find usually is that that's already your captive audience. Those are the people that were going to be there anyways, right? And if you're trying to bridge a gap, right, it's identifying who across those constituencies are willing to be a part of something like this, right? And finding a facilitator that can hold that for you. Because I do think that sometimes the mistake that communities make, even if it's specifically at an organizational or educational level in your case, is that you try to do the work yourselves. You gotta bring in someone that knows how to do that, both the facilitation, but understands how to hold a conversation through difference, which is a very different kind of conversation to hold, right? So that's would be my sort of advice, and trying to identify, and usually what I do in my own practice is that how we identify the coalition of the willing is through, usually a rigorous sort of interview process that we co-create sort of questions with our clients to be able to have those conversations and come back and say, okay, this is who we think is willing to engage in this kind of journey with you, right? And I think there's a lot of great, folks that think in this way, that understand that you got to take people through a journey. It's not coming to a workshop. You got to take people through a journey, and the last thing I'll say is that the mistake often that happens in these spaces is that you put an outcome before the process, right? So you say that the outcome is you want to do X. And then all you focus on all the time is, well, what are we doing relative to the outcome? But what about the process? How is the process designed? How is it engaging people? Are people moving? Or is it the same people saying the same thing? Right? And then the dominant thinking gets to kind of just sit there, comfortable in their silence, because that's what dominant thinking gets to do.
Thank you.
No, of course.
Great. So I think next on the list is Seth. Are you there, Seth?
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, I'm a current Tufts student. Thank you so much for coming to talk today. My question was, I know that you are currently helping a Democratic gubernatorial candidate.
Yes.
But I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the 2022 race, why you think Democrats have struggled to get control of the governorship in Massachusetts, which is obviously such a Democratic state, and like what you think Democrats need to do or change in 2022 to win.
Well, I love this question, and I love that you made it about the bigger ecosystem and not just the governor's race, because I think it's an important distinction. And the one thing I'll share is that we do a lot of like down ballot and all around sort of political research in the state in my firm. And what I would say fundamentally, as you asked all those questions, and I also want to say these are sort of all the right questions to be asking right now. Also, is that it's a couple of things, right? But I think first, people fundamentally don't understand how power works in Massachusetts, right? So the difference between the federal delegation, constitutional offices, and leadership in the state house, people just fundamentally don't understand that. So that's one thing, right? Second, at a more sort of granular level, people also don't understand how power has shifted in the last 20 years. Right. So people will point to the first of an Ayanna Pressley, a Deval Patrick, we have a bigger delegation of people of color in the state house. They'll point to all these different kind of firsts and like, increments of progress that we have. But ultimately, no one's actually looked at how power has shifted in the state and why. Right. And from our own research and the work that we've done is that what's happened over the course of the last 20 years is that even though the people of color population and the Democratic electorate has actually expanded over the last, or likely Democratic has expanded over the last 20 years. Conservative Democrats and Republicans have centralized their power along with moderates in the state, and that conglomeration of power affects state level politics, but we don't actually see it play out federally. So what happens, right, if you're the everyday activist, is that you're looking for the fight that aligns with your value. You're not trying to dissect things in the way that I just talked about, right? Right? You're just trying to simply align your values with an organization, a campaign, or a candidate, right? But I think that the work that Massachusetts has to do is that we got to study ourselves and we got to build trust amongst ourselves to also understand what's happened in our state. Why is it that the unenrolled is the largest slice of the electorate? I am called a Democratic consultant, and I am, but I'm also an unenrolled person. I have been unenrolled since the beginning. Since the first time I voted at 18 in Massachusetts. I've been unenrolled. I'm in the unenrolled party. And why is it that slice of the electorate has also continued to increase, right? What it means is that voters like to have like to make sure that they have good Democrats in the state house, but they want accountability in the corner office. And what that means in terms of a Republican, but what that means practically too is that Democrats don't know how to organize other Democrats. Fundamentally, right? So when it comes to the governor's race next year or down the road, whatever it may be, how are Democrats organizing other Democrats? One, and second, how are we organizing those that are not part of the process, right? And those that are not part of the process, whether they're young people or people of color, are the growing population of the state. And the census is only going to indicate that pretty soon, right? We're going to have more majority minority districts in the state, right? And what does these population shifts mean when representation actually is the same? Right. So I think that those are the kinds of things that we really should be having some, we love to talk about the national conversation in Massachusetts, but it's a distraction. What's our reckoning moment, right? What does equity mean here, right? And how does it land here? Because we can't see it from the lens of Trump. We can't see it from the lens of the federal government either. So as you can see, Seth, I have a lot to say on this one. So you should definitely reach out to us if there's more you want to be involved in or get to know in this kind of work. So.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Seth. So our last question is from L'Oreal.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. Tufts alum from Chicago as well. The biggest thing for me is, or the question I wanted to ask was just, how do you compromise your values with, or how do you compromise, or how do you let go of certain values that you have with the values or the compromises that politicians or these elected officials that you're working with, how do they like get to work, and how do they like ultimately compromise so that they can potentially get in those offices and these positions of power?
I mean, what I would say, first is that I personally try to avoid as much as possible being in a situation where I have to compromise my values. But I do understand that a practical part of this work is reconciling my values, right? And the difference with that is this: it's not a wordsmith difference, right? I don't want to play that game with you either. But the reason why it matters is that the reality of how this country is set up, right? Going back to the point I said earlier in terms of the relationship between power, money, and systems, means that in the process of getting the result, right, there are going to become moments of strategic reconciliation with what's possible, right? But what I want to make sure before I'm in that room is, do I have a common ground of values with the people that I'm going to be making this decision with? Because if I don't, chances are we're going to end up making decisions that I can't live with, right? But the truth is that life is life. People want to make a decision at some point. You can't control that, right? But at that point, then you have your own moral compass, right? And what I've learned is that I have left situations where I felt, you know what? This is going to go from reconciling to compromising. This doesn't feel right. So I'm going to move on, right? And that's also a marker of my own leadership, in that I will say no, right? To lots of opportunities that people are like, oh, but this is a slam dunk. And I'm like, yeah, but like, they really just want my name. They don't care about the approach. They don't want to build trust, right? They want to get a shortcut, right? So I think that like, that's the other thing. The more you practice the recognition of when you're reconciling your values versus when you're compromising them, the more you also know, you develop your own muscle and experience of like reading a room or a situation where you're like, literally, I can tell by an email sometimes that like, I'm like, yeah, I can't even, I'm like, I can tell. I'm like, I can already tell by the way that they crafted that sentence, right? But so I would offer that, right? Honestly, because, at the end of the day, like, who your team is matters, right? And what I've learned is that I need to be in a team where I have a common ground where when these tough moments come, we can reconcile our values together. Right. And that if we don't, then I have a choice on whether I want to be part of this team or not. And I think that's a much tougher reality for a lot of people because of the reality of employment and livelihoods. Right. But I will also just be very blank. It's also why I have my own consulting company. I can make those choices a little bit more freely now. It doesn't mean I still don't have to reconcile my values, because I do at some points, but I have less of that now. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, great. Well, that concludes the webinar for the afternoon. I want to thank Wilnelia so much for joining us. What a wonderful conversation. I also want to thank Tom and JB and the rest of the attendees, and also everybody watching from wherever you all are. Have a great rest of your day.